Friends, welcome. Great to have you all here. My name is Sam Heath, and this is In the Movement. So, this is a webinar series that we've been doing for several years, and the goal of it has been to engage and elevate the work of people within the movement, meaning the justice movement. And there's so many parts and pieces of what that looks like. I had to, for the intro, play a little bit of John Batiste in honor of him singing the national anthem at the Super Bowl. He's been on my mind. So thanks for joining us. My name is Sam Heath, and I work with Equal Justice USA. So we're a national nonprofit, and we do work around death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety. And my role with EJUSA is that I help lead the work at our evangelical network. And the role there is to engage those within the Christian world, especially evangelical Christians. I'll put in the chat our link to our Facebook page, and please feel free to follow us there. You'll get to hear lots more about events like this and a lot of resources and articles and videos that come up. We post at least once a day so that you can see a lot of happenings within the justice world that's here. So we'll talk in this webinar series, and definitely today, you'll hear us talk about mass incarceration. And I want to flag something with that. Mass incarceration really is just a description of how big our criminal legal system is. It's not really a judgment of the system. It's just describing that we have the biggest criminal legal system by every measure in the history of human civilization. What is really key, though, is that I want us in this space to press deeper into that and see mass incarceration not necessarily as the problem, but as a symptom of something else. And that something else is a level deeper. And the whole system that we have of how we respond largely as a country to violence, harm, and crime, it's a fear-based system. And in this space, anybody's welcome to be here, but we especially help hold it for Christians because for Christians, the most repeated command in Scripture is do not fear. And yet, what do we see with the criminal legal system but an incredibly fear-based system? So, we want to talk about how that's real, how to work against that. And so we've been looking at all sorts of parts and pieces, as I said, of what the criminal legal system is and what's a different way of responding to it. Last month and this month, we've been talking about restorative practices and especially restorative justice. And so our guest is Felix Rosado, who's here today. And he's going to talk about and share a good bit of his story. I'll intro him, but all that we'll share today is really under this heading. What is restorative justice? What's a restorative response to violence, harm, or crime? Because that's not often really what we have. So, just a bit of Felix's story. He'll talk about how he was given a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Some people call it LWOP as an abbreviation. And he was in prison for 27 years. In 2022, his sentence was commuted. Yet, while inside, Felix had an encounter with a lot of things. One piece that was massive was restorative justice. And that's work that he carries out into his daily life as a practitioner of that today. He does a lot of work within Philadelphia, and he has interest and skills in restorative justice and peace building, but that's a practical thing for him. He's an author. We'll talk about his book, and he helps manage a youth restorative justice diversion program with his family in Philadelphia. So, Felix, thanks for being here. Feel free to share a couple other words other than what I said, and I'm
Mhm.
excited to dive in.
Thanks for having me, Sam. It's an honor. And I'm happy to be joining from Philly, still flying high from the Eagles Super Bowl victory. And
Congrats.
looking forward to this conversation.
Congrats. Great. A couple other logistical things. Feel free, friends, to put in there um, into the chat your name, your group, your org, your location, if you want to share that. It's always fun to see where people are coming in from. I'll also say any link that we mention or any link that we might put in the chat, I'm going to make sure to capture those. And because you're here, you're registered, you'll get all those links emailed to you. What Felix and I will talk about with the recording of this, with his book. We'll make sure to get you all of that information. And this is recorded, so we'll get you both an audio recording of it and a link to YouTube so that you can look back at this. So sit back and relax in this, meaning you don't have to grab all of the links, but also think through what you might want to ask. We'll save some time at the end if you have questions for Felix and the work that he's engaged in. You can put those in the chat at any point, Or and you can also click on the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of the screen, and you can put those in, and we'll make sure to circle back to those as we work through our time. But we're thankful that everybody's here, and we really want to talk through this. So, Felix, maybe let's start here. When you tell people what restorative justice is, how do you define it, or what are some things that you really emphasize when you're explaining what this is?
Hmm. Well, first and foremost, it's a people process. It's a way of doing justice that seeks to heal harm by involving those who were directly impacted by it, including the people who caused it, which is vastly different than how the criminal punishment system views justice. And as uh, my comrade Fania Davis likes to say, restorative justice is a pre-colonial, pre-slavery, pre-genocide justice. It's how people were doing things before this new system came and overtook our better senses.
I love that you emphasized two things. One, restorative justice isn't new. It's not something that's uniquely American. It's something that goes back to so many cultures across the world, especially indigenous cultures. And I love that you started with people, that this is a process, it's a posture, it's a way of being. I'm going to quote Erica Washington. I know you know her and she works with EJUSA, but she always talks about that restorative justice is about relationship. And
Hmm.
it's about people. It's about being in relationship and responding to harm in certain ways. And in another label it might have been me putting it on you, but the idea of being a peace builder, a peacemaker. I mean, one, it's important for us as Christians as we think about the Beatitudes and blessed are the peacemakers, but that's a practice of something that can be put into each area of our life. So while restorative justice might be a specific way of responding to something like violence, harm, or crime, living a life of restoration can be all the things. And last month, that's part of what we talked about in the webinar with Jazz and Simone about what does it look like to live our life in this way. And your life, I know, was radically changed by restorative justice. So can you walk us through a little bit of what that process was like, kind of where were you when you really initially encountered this way of being in relationship with others?
Hmm. Well, I was introduced to restorative justice, or rather, restorative justice found me through Howard Zerr book
Hmm.
titled Transcending, which is a photo essay book of people who had lost loved ones to violence. And so it was assigned to me in a class I was taking at the time, and I still remember the day when I was sitting in that cell with the book spread open across my lap, turning page after page, looking at face after face, and reading heartbreaking story after heartbreaking story. And at some point, it hit me that I had caused a family that same type of pain, something that I had avoided dealing with for 12 years prior. Because in so many ways, the system prevents you from doing that kind of internal work. It incentivizes deceit and punishes truth telling at every stage. So here I was coming to terms with this truth, and it really shook me up. And at the end of the book, Howard, now a really dear friend of mine, started talking about this thing called restorative justice, which I had never heard of before, but I thought it was revolutionary. My initial thought was, why didn't someone come up with this idea sooner? And I quickly learned that people did indeed come up with this a lot earlier. But it sparked an interest, and that interest quickly became a passion. I started reading more and more books on it. As fate would have it, I met another brother in the prison who was passionate about restorative justice. His name is Charles Boyd. He's currently in year 42 of his death by incarceration sentence. And together we co-founded a restorative justice education project we later named Let's Circle Up, to introduce as many other people in the prison to restorative justice as possible so they could experience what we were experiencing.
I want to flag something for people, and it relates to what you said. I'll put this in the chat, friends, and it'll also be in that email. But part of the webinar today, it's co-sponsored by a group that Felix and I both know, CCDA, or the Christian Community Development Association. And this week is what's called their Locked in Solidarity Week, meaning locked in solidarity with those who are experiencing or working against mass incarceration. And I put the link there. You can read a little more about it. Each year, there's a week-long focus of events and advocacy and opportunities all over the country around mass incarceration. The theme for this week, and we're in the middle of this week for Locked in Solidarity Week right now, is this idea of interrupting violence. And so, Felix, maybe let's camp there for a bit as we think about what violence is, because it's so many things. Or earlier I made a point to say and talk about violence, harm, and crime, which are not always the same thing. There are a lot of things that are violent or harmful that aren't criminalized. And so, it takes a lot of terms to kind of capture all of those things. But how do you see something like restorative justice interrupting violence? And I'm also kind of assuming with people like hearing like violence is a cycle. It continues on until something stops it. And so what is it that you saw about restorative justice of how it uniquely interrupted or stopped violence?
Yeah. Well, that cycle that you described is really key to this discussion, because what the prison system does is it continues that cycle and exacerbates it.
Mm.
It 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 produces all the same causes of violence that led people to be there in the first place, and builds on them and strengthens, them. So restorative justice seeks to come in and break that up. It seeks to heal past harms, but in doing so, it also prevents future harms.
Mm.
I truly believe that when people come face to face with the consequences of their actions, hearing it directly from the people who they hurt, they're less likely to cause it again.
Mhm.
Prison doesn't give you the opportunity to actually do that work. It talks a good game about accountability, but
Mhm.
I argue that prison is the antithesis of accountability. It punishes you and produces all kinds of pain on you, your family, your community, but it doesn't do anything to give you opportunities to put things, as we like to say in restorative justice, more right. It actually prevents all of that. So in restorative justice, people are empowered
Mhm.
to have conversations about what justice should look like in any given situation. And it's going to be different for everyone, depending on environment and context and what the harm was and who the people involved are. Uh, so restorative justice actually appreciates all those nuances and takes them into account. And it gives people an opportunity to really look at what happened and what needs to happen. As far as the system is concerned, some harm occurred, a sentence is handed down, and that's the end of it.
Mhm.
Restorative justice says, no, wait, there's more to the story. There's
Mm.
more that needs to be written here. And it gives each participant a, a pen and a piece of paper and allows us all to write.
Sometimes I talk with others about my one of my favorite things about restorative justice, other than that it's people centered, is how creative it can
Mm.
get. And I hear part of you saying part of that with a blank piece of paper, like in a way, kind of the sky's the limit for what the options are of what healing could look like for all the parties involved. Whereas within the system, it's really regulated, it's really cookie cutter, it's rigid, it's a set thing. But restorative justice gives that flexibility to respond to people in a humanizing way. What got you to a space to think about this? I mean, you were within the system for almost 3 decades, and here you are though talking about these things in this way, but you endured the system that
Mm.
wasn't working towards these things. So what brought you, kind of in addition to Howard Zier's book, to a place to think and engage and now like live a life where you're helping lead others in that?
And just to be clear, my transformation took place despite the prison,
Hmm.
not because of it. Everything in that place was and is designed to keep me exactly where I was. In so many ways, had to break myself free from that
Hmm.
and convict myself of a life of accountability and healing and service to others. And so there were a couple pivotal moments in my incarceration. Uh, the first one I would say happened in 2004, year nine of my incarceration, when I was in the restricted housing unit, aka the Hole. For those who don't know what that is, it's solitary confinement where you go with none of your property uh, for 30, 60, 90 days, even years at a time, when you break any of the millions of prison rules. So I was down there doing 90 days, and by this time I'm 27, I think. According to the neuroscientists, my brain is fully developed. I'm thinking differently, and I started to ask myself some tough questions one afternoon. And I ended up like doing some serious reflection on my life and identifying some key moments where my life took a serious downward turn. And so I came to the conclusion that I had to try something different, and that what I was doing wasn't working. So I came out with a new focus, and I got into my law work. Long story short, I found my way back into court. Hope started to replace despair, but I still felt like something was missing. And so I reconnected with the Catholic faith of my upbringing. I went to the chaplain at the time in the prison and talked with him about it, shared some of my story, and started to go to mass that weekend, and I haven't missed one since actually. And so that kind of springboarded me into a bunch of other things. I ended up getting a job at the prison chapel. I ended up meeting new guys in the prison who I didn't know before, who were much older than me, and who were showing me through example what it was like to live a life of selflessness and purpose. So anyway, I ended up getting involved with this program, speaking with boys from a nearby juvenile hall who came into the prison once a month to hear from a group of us about what their lives could look like if they continue what they were doing.
Hmm.
And I remember that being so life-changing for me. Just knowing that despite being behind Great Effort State Prison's 30-foot high concrete wall, and despite being sentenced to grow old and die there, I could still have an impact on someone's life. Unfortunately, that program got shut down 6 months later, but by that time, I had enrolled in a bachelor's degree program through Villanova University. I was taking that class I mentioned earlier that introduced me to restorative justice, and then I went on to co-found the Restorative Justice Project myself. And from there, it just took off.
Hmm.
At some point, I became a hospice caregiver. And so, anyway, all these different acts of service I was doing uh, made me reconnect
Hmm.
with my humanity, and shifting that focus from myself to helping others was the key. Because when I was trying to do things for myself, I was running into one brick wall after another.
Hmm.
But as soon as I made that shift, doors started to open up. I started building all these amazing relationships and connections with people on the outside and the outside world in general. And it ultimately set me on a path that walked me right out of that place
Hmm.
years later.
I'm struck a lot by how service is really formative in serving others. It's something I try to remember. It's something I try to say say to my kids. But the act of giving of ourselves to others forms us and stretches us in these ways that I hear you saying often are really unexpected. You specifically talked about being on the hospice care team, and we talked a little bit offline about that before, and I'd love to hear more about that, and also make sure people hear like this is while you were inside. So what did that care look like, And then I think that can bring us into talking about you don't call your sentence life without possibility of parole. You give it another name, and part of that relates to your encounter with what you saw on the hospice care team. So, how did that roll out for you?
Yeah. I reject the word life uh, from any mention of the sentence I overcame, and that, tens of thousands of people are still fighting uh, because it's not life. What do you think of when you think of life? Right? I'm living life now. In there, I was dying. You know, uh, and so in Pennsylvania, at least, and in several other states, life without parole, as you called it, means that you stay there until you take your dying breath.
Mhm.
And that didn't hit me until I got to the state prison. Even when the judge banged his gavel and said, "I sentenced you to life without parole," I thought, like most people walking around in society, that it meant 20 years, 15 if you behave, which is still a lot,
Hmm.
but I thought that there would be an end to it at some point. And then I got there and I saw with my own eyes men who had been there 3 decades, 3.5 decades, 4 decades, uh, twice as long as I had been alive. I was 18 when I started this sentence. And so, you know, seeing that, really shook me to my core. And so, I started asking around, like, what's up with these guys? Why are they so old? What happened? And, people were telling me, look, I mean, they got the same sentence you got. And, that led me down a path of, hopelessness
Hmm.
that put me in a cycle of going in and out of the hole for about 8 years, until I had that moment of awakening I described earlier. Uh, so anyway, you know, along the way, I ended up joining the hospice caregiving team. It's a team of, I think, I think there were about 12 of us at the time, maybe 15. We didn't get paid. We sat with men around the clock in 4-hour shifts as they took the last breaths of their death by incarceration sentences. I held men's hands, you know, uh, rubbed their heads, read scriptures to them, fed them, cleaned them, all the things that the state wasn't going to do. Uh, if it was left up to them, they just lay there until they die. And so I got to witness what a death by incarceration sentence looks like when it comes to its end. You know, uh, Most people will never see that. People in society will never see it, but people inside the prison will never see it either. I was just part of this small group of guys who had that opportunity. And honestly, Sam, when I first heard about this program, I rejected it, for mostly for political reasons. My position was, if the state's going to sentence someone to die, then they should take care of them. It shouldn't be left on a group of volunteers who are incarcerated to do their work. But then I came to realize, after hearing stories from other people who were on the team, that it wasn't going to be done and people deserve to die with dignity.
Hmm.
So I ended up joining the team, and it changed me in so many ways. Uh, I still remember my first shift. I My shift was 11 to 3 in the morning. And I'd walk back to the cell block I walked back to the cell block afterwards in the middle of the night. Prison was empty. And you know, just feeling like my movements were slower. I was more patient. The next
Hmm.
day, like when everyone woke up and we went to breakfast, I just found myself moving at a much slower pace, and
Hmm.
just practicing an extraordinary amount of patience with others. And that came from sitting with men and having to spend an hour of my shift trying to help someone enjoy like 2 sips of coffee. you know? Uh, so anyway, that was, as I said, really, really transformative. And, the sentence is extremely cruel and unfortunately not unusual enough. The numbers of people fighting these sentences has actually increased,
Yeah.
uh, according to a new report that was just released recently.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talking about that report, I'm going to try to remember to put that in the resources we send out. But two facts from it that I'm thinking of is that one out of six individuals in prison have a sentence of life without parole within the US. And 40% of those people in the world who have sentences of life without parole are here within the US. So it in some ways it's a uniquely American sentence that we do that. And to your point, you're not making a distinction between something like the death penalty or death by execution versus life without parole. Like both sentences are imposed by the state and meant to end ultimately in death. And so yeah, I
Yeah.
heard you use the phrase death by incarceration, describing that as well.
And that's why I use it. It's America's other death penalty.
Hmm.
Over 56,000 humans are currently fighting that sentence. Uh, Another 97,000 are fighting life with parole, and then 41,000 are fighting what's been dubbed virtual life, a
Hmm.
sentence of uh, at least 50 years. So all in all, 195,000 people are either going to grow old and die in prison or have a slim chance of release while geriatric.
Hmm.
Uh, this is uniquely American.
Hmm.
And, I prefer to call it death by incarceration because unfortunately, many so-called death penalty abolitionists advocate for what's called life without parole as a more viable and more humane alternative. And, fortunately, EJUSA is not one of those organizations, and others are starting to move in the direction of seeing them both as equally cruel and,
Right.
harmful to our society. But I'm just trying to raise as much awareness about the sentence as possible as one of the few people who were able to escape it.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate, and it's heavy to hear you giving the numbers. I mean, I'm looking back to last week. There were two executions at a state level. This week there are two more that are happening, and yet we still have that reality of individuals with that death by incarceration sentence. You also alluded to solitary confinement earlier, which is big, and thankfully there's campaigns like Unlock the Box working against that. Uh, it- but it's interesting is a euphemism. It's disturbing hearing how the system characterizes it. In Virginia, I know that they talk about solitary confinement with the language of calling it restorative housing. You used a phrase earlier that was kind of in that same vein, but it's baptizing a reality of what it is. It's this confinement. You're alone, you're ostracized, you're separated, and that is not a place that we know just from basic logic, but also from science that it's not conducive to healing and to help. So the system as a whole, you're right, is against so many of these measures of healing that we see. But it's key, especially in the advocacy world, that we start to look at it in that big way and make those connections and start to ask the question of, well, why has each state that's into the death penalty, most recently here in Virginia in 2021, the 27th state, that many of those states, or it might be all of them, go from having the death penalty to then converting those sentences to life without parole without really skipping a beat, which is what happened when President Biden commuted the 37 people on federal death row. People are still making that connection rather than the way that you're speaking of it.
And it's not a one for one trade-off, as death by lethal injection has waned in this country. Uh, Death by incarceration has skyrocketed. The numbers are, you know, really disturbing. And half of the death by incarceration population comes out of five states: Florida, California, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, and Michigan. And, when we talk about the traditional death penalty, capital punishment, it's mostly relegated to down
Mm.
south states. But, here we have states that, are so-called blue states
Mhm.
leading the way on this sentence because it's not getting a lot of attention or scrutiny. Uh, you know, I recently learned that a couple people uh, who President Biden uh, attempted to commute uh, from the death penalty to death by incarceration rejected it
Mm.
because they were going to have less appeal rights and all the support that they were getting
Right.
from the
Mm.
anti-death penalty movement was going to slip away.
Right.
And so, if that isn't telling,
Right.
I don't know what is.
Yeah.
They basically said, "I'll pass on that." You know?
Yeah. I see someone asking in the chat something that might really get Felix fired up, and that'd be good. Of asking, is there no rehabilitation within the system? And to a degree, the short answer is no. But also, how are we defining rehabilitation? The system defines that in a very quantifiable, almost scientific, very distant, dehumanizing way. Whereas when we're talking about actual rehabilitation, we're talking about actual healing, which requires those things that you're naming earlier, Felix. Restorative justice has at its core, but yet the system, it's adversarial, it's binary, it's one person against another. It doesn't allow for you to acknowledge the harm, to do an act of repair, to change things so it can't happen again. It prevents those things that we know are necessary and possible for there to be healing. But yet there are programs, there's groups that come in, right? There's cracks all within that. But I
Yeah,
think I heard you say earlier, so much of that is often in spite of the system.
yeah, yeah. And I would. I also want to make clear that I was in a unique state prison. Greaterford uh, was the fifth largest in the country, uh, infamous for a lot of bad things. Just a lot of violence, drugs, and corruption, but also was relatively open to the outside world. It gave a lot of access to people to come in to provide and assist with programming. As I mentioned earlier, I got to enroll in a bachelor's degree program uh, through through a nearby university. Uh, and so I got to meet a lot of people from the outside and,
Mm.
connect and build with. And a lot of those people supported me when it came time to apply for clemency uh, to the governor. And that made a big difference. But the other 20 something prisons in Pennsylvania didn't have any of that.
Mm.
And I'm sure the same is true for many of them around the country.
Mhm.
And the Department of Corrections was hell bent on closing Graterford and ending what they called the Graterford culture, which like really meant we don't want community, we don't want people gathering, we don't want people having these opportunities to transform themselves and to learn and to grow. So anyway, they ended up closing Graterford in 2018 and shipping us to a new prison that they built right next door called SCI Phoenix. And so it took a while to try to get everything up and running again. Some of it, never got started again. And then COVID hit
Mm.
in 2020 and they locked us completely down. We were
Yeah.
coming out of our cell 15 minutes a day, one cell at a time, to either use the phone or take a shower, and that was it. Uh, and then as they slowly started to open up, four cells at a time for 45 minutes, eight cells at a time for 90 minutes, that went on. They dragged that out for 2 years,
Mm.
and eventually they started opening some of the programming again. The stuff that was led by staff and but a lot of the policies that came out of that are still in place today, because they fell in love with a lockdown prison, with limited movement and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the meals are being served to to people in their cells. They no
Mm-hmm.
longer get to walk to the chow hall and talk with their friends on the way there and see people in the walkways and
Yeah.
have a meal together. All that is gone, and it doesn't seem like they want to return to it anytime soon, which really breaks my heart because all the things that gave my life meaning for all those years are gone right now. Men are basically, and women are just going in and doing raw time and coming out worse than what they came in. And still, I'm sure people are finding ways to discover, things inside themselves. But
Mm-hmm.
it takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
It takes community. You got to meet other people who are, on the same path. And fortunately, that was the case for me.
Mm.
But in terms of rehabilitation, you'll find that word on a, a, probably every Department of Corrections, mission statement. Honestly, I don't know what they mean by it. You mentioned it might have a bunch of different definitions depending on who you ask. You know, uh, Most people weren't okay when they went to prison. I would dare to say,
Right.
all everyone.
Right.
know,
Right.
uh, so what are we bringing people like back to? That re-prefix of the word is
Right.
really problematic. And so if people's needs weren't met beforehand, uh, they're certainly going to have an even harder time coming out of prison, facing all the obstacles and barriers
Yeah.
that keep you from integrating successfully.
Yeah, it's a false promise, I think, that rehabilitation piece. Danielle Sered, who many of you know helps lead some restorative justice work up in Brooklyn, New York, and across the country, she often talks about the very things that we need to thrive as humans are what prison and the system intentionally remove. We need community. We need access to resources. We need to engage and deal with and work through trauma. And yet, those are often the very things, not often, those are the very things that prison removes. You're isolated, you're not with community, you're stripped of your resources, you're not able to engage with that healing. And if you do, like you said, it's sometimes in spite of the system. I see Amy Williams is here and she's in the chat talking about some of the juvenile work that she does. And if she were here, I know that she says, instead of slinging dope, she's slinging hope. So I'm going to quote her there. And it
Keep
isn't that
slanging.
memorable. But she does work within, especially juvenile detention centers. But yet, what the work that you're doing is focused on those that are outside. At least if we're talking about healing futures. So one, I'd love to hear about healing futures. Let's circle up in your book. Kind of what does this work look like now? Because you also talked about if we engage people now, whether they're in the system or not, imagine the future harm that we are preventing. Imagine the cycle that we're interrupting. So what does that look like? Maybe starting with healing futures.
Yeah. So Healing Futures is Philadelphia's first pre-charge youth restorative justice diversion program. I co-manage it currently, and we have an awesome team of facilitators who are out here in the community, trying to make some change and trying to bring some healing. So we get our referrals from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office of young people who've been arrested for a variety of different things. We enroll them and guide them through our process, and at the end of it, their charges get dismissed, and they can hopefully go on with their lives happily and successfully without the stain of a criminal record or the trauma of having spent any time inside a cage. It's a restorative justice program, so we're working with them to get as many of their needs met as possible. We gather and share resources for them and their families, and we're doing the same with the people harmed in whatever the situation was. So we try to identify what the needs are, try to get them some resources, and then we have sessions once a week with the young people to like really explore. who they are, who their people are, what their values are. We dig into accountability. We have a fun day. We stop talking about apologies and all that for one day, and we go out somewhere that they want to go to,
Mhm.
and just have fun. And we allow them to actually be kids. Kids aren't given the opportunity to be children anymore.
Yeah.
They're seeped in trauma, paranoid, having to look over their shoulder, having to care for younger siblings or even their own parents in some cases. Uh, at at ages when you should be outside playing. Uh, so anyway, we take them somewhere where they could take the mask off, the literal ski mask, and also the metaphoric mask that they tend to walk around wearing. And then after that, we get back to business and we start working on their apology letter. So anyway, all of it ultimately leads to an encounter with the responsible youth and
Mm.
the person harmed in a circle with supporters of both and a couple community members, facilitated by two members of the Healing Futures team.
Mm.
And we talk
Mm.
about what happened. The person harmed gets to talk in as much detail as they want about the impact of the harm. And the responsible youth apologizes and says whatever else they feel moved to say, and then we open the floor up, and the community members can chime in with some wisdom. The facilitators can say some things, and then once we think we're at a good place, we turn our attention to developing a plan.
Mhm.
And so this is a concrete action that the young person has to go and do,
Mhm.
put things more
Mhm.
right. And when they complete it, the case is closed, and we throw them all a celebration
Right.
to celebrate the fact that the community came together to try something different, and that a young person held themselves accountable.
Yeah.
Right? The
Yeah.
system didn't hold them accountable; they held themselves accountable. So that's a
Right.
really big deal.
Wow.
So that's the
That's
process.
beautiful.
Uh,
Yeah.
we we have multiple cases happening at the same time in all different stages of that process. And we get to also build with awesome community organizations who are doing incredible work that never, gets talked about. But we collaborate with them in, developing some of the plans for these young people. So they're usually volunteering with some organization out in the city, doing work, that improves the health of the community, uh,
Hmm.
rather than sit in a cage somewhere, which
Hmm.
helps no one. No
Right.
one benefits from that. The
Right.
person harmed isn't satisfied. They're not satisfied. They're missing out in school. Their like family is suffering. So anyway, we try our best to interrupt the cycle that
Mm.
named earlier, and so far, we only have one young person out of almost 50 who was rearrested, and even in that case, we didn't let him go. I'm still working with him. We're still trying to work out, ways to make his situation better,
Hmm.
moving forward. So you get to be part of a community too.
Yeah.
You get to meet different people in the city who you would have never known otherwise. The community members who come to the circle, people at Healing Futures, and at my organization, Youth Art and Self Empowerment Project. They come to the office, meet the staff, meet other young people. So that community piece is so crucial,
Hmm.
especially when you're stuck in a situation where you hardly ever leave the block you live on.
Hmm.
You don't like, I some of our fun days are like simply to go to the waterfront or like some part of the city, that they didn't even know existed.
Hmm.
So we're just trying to expand people's, ideas and perspectives and choices.
Yeah.
Because the more choices you have, the freer you are.
Yeah.
Our goal is always freedom.
Mm. I hear you saying so much of you're helping create the conditions for people to move into accountability. You're creating a place of literal and figurative safety. You're giving support. you're giving someone that space, you're giving breaks from that intensity too, and giving them the ability to face it. I also love that you're not talking about accountability as something that you force or bring on someone, right? Accountability ultimately is something that you have to offer, you have to step into. And there have to be certain conditions that it sounds like you're making so that people lean into that. And here's another plug for my favorite acronym I've said in this space before of ARC or ARC of like what actual accountability and restorative justice is. You acknowledge the harm that you've done, the effect that it has on someone. You do some act of repair that's a physical action dictated by the person you harmed, and then you change things, ideally so it can't happen again. We could talk for another few hours about how the system prevents each of those three in
Yeah.
very, very intentional ways. But yet, the work that you're doing makes space for that. So I know you also chronicle some of this in your book. So I want to make sure, talk about that too. I'll put the title in the chat and I'll make sure to send people the link. But what is this?
So Let's Circle Up is the Restorative Justice Education Project I co-founded with Charles Boyd, who I talked about earlier. And it started inside Greaterford State Prison. We decided that we wanted to create opportunities for others to be introduced to restorative justice, and we created an intro to RJ workshop. And it just got better and better as we kept refining it, and it it gathered a lot of interest in the prison. And after a while, we couldn't go anywhere without someone handing us their name on a piece of paper
Mm,
asking to be signed up. And this was created by us. No staff were involved. No people who received Department of Corrections paychecks were involved at all. None of them were in the room. And I because of what I mentioned earlier, this was a unique prison that
right.
allowed for this kind of thing.
Wow.
So anyway, we needed it to be experiential, participatory, and fun, and non-academic,
Mm,
because we wanted it to be accessible to whoever, regardless of your background or your education level. We needed we needed everyone to be able to experience this. So we created a bunch of activities, all diverse, that have us using all different parts of our brains. We're creating art, we're role playing, we're responding to prompts with our bodies, moving around the room. We're in small groups, large groups, pairs, all kind of things. And it really focuses on community building.
mm,
It starts with that and it continues with it throughout. And people at the end of the workshop are friends, speak to each other outside of the classroom, and otherwise wouldn't have. And that was really important to us too. So anyway, after a while, I started writing out the curriculum, and it eventually turned into a manual, which Living Justice Press just published last summer. So I started it on the inside. I was able to do the final edits after I got out, and it's now available
wow.
for anybody to pick up and to develop and lead an intro to restorative justice workshop that could be applied in any setting, prison, church, school.
Mm,
I actually took that curriculum and turned it into a semester-long college course that I teach at a school out here in Philly. So it works everywhere and it gets the same results everywhere. People are empowered afterwards. They know about what restorative justice is, and it's not easy. It takes
right.
at least, like the first 3 sessions before people can start seeing justice outside of the criminal punishment system
Mm,
context. Because we've been conditioned, right?
yeah.
All of
Yeah,
us.
that's the
No one's
default.
immune from that. We've been conditioned to see justice as synonymous with cops, courtrooms, and cages. And so we really have to break that down so we can start to imagine something new. And imagination runs throughout this curriculum. We're being inspired and challenged and nudged to use our imagination, because
Mm,
that's what's lacking in the criminal punishment system.
mm,
It's a total lack of imagination.
yeah.
It, here's this, and it's supposed to lead to this, and this sentence goes to this. And I just want to say, for all the neatness that the system claims to, have and produce, it's anything but.
Yeah.
It's really a sloppy system.
Yeah.
It's an assembly line
Mm,
that
hmm.
feeds people into the mouths of the beast, and it's it's not simply you do this, you get this, as
Yeah.
it's sold to us.
Yeah.
It's way more messy and dirty than that.
Mm. That's a little bit of the abolitionist in you coming out, which I was hoping we get to see.
Absolutely.
Well, as Christians, we both know throughout life we will continue to struggle and to make mistakes. And at the same time, in your life, we have seen incredible growth and healing. And there's one friend in the chat who's asking, and I really want to lift this question up. How have you been healing from the trauma of being within the system? Does that still linger? What does it look like for that continual healing process to happen?
That will always linger.
Yeah.
Uh, when I hear keys dangling or
Mm,
boots stomping on the ground, I I clench. I think COs are running to break up a fight somewhere. You know, yeah, that's in my body. That's not going to go anywhere. But I went to therapy when I came home. I was in therapy for about a year and a half, every single week, 2 hours a session. Talking and sharing stories and just trying to make sense of how I even survived that. You know. But I I came out into a huge network of wide open arms, you know, uh, of support,
mm,
and I'm really unique and blessed in that regard. Most people don't have that coming out of prison, and
mhm.
two-thirds of people return within 3 years. That number has always been the case, right? Every year since the inception of the first penitentiary. And so it's really doing what it's designed to do, And so fortunately, I came out with a college degree with a few job offers awaiting me, places to stay. That's not typical. So, God has been really good to me, and I'm blessed, and I'm making the most of it.
Yeah.
I jumped right into my job a week after getting out, in my current role at Healing Futures, and I immediately had purpose out here, and I got two more jobs, teaching at two different colleges, and
Mm.
I'm doing a lot of other work on the side. I'm on various committees and
And you're a
boards.
family man, Felix. Don't forget.
Yeah, and I'm a first-time dad.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I have a 7-month-old, turned 7 months today. Uh,
Oh, I didn't know that.
precious,
Congrats.
precious jubilee, and so I have a family. I'm a homeowner. I'm engaged. I'm about to get married in August. So everything has come together,
Well,
and I'll say this, my mother, who also was incarcerated, right? Like she did every day of that time with me here on the outside. I do want to mention that prison doesn't just incarcerate people
mm,
who committed or allegedly committed a crime. It incarcerates their loved ones, their
mm,
families, entire communities. So my mother, while I was inside, used to tell me at the end of every visit, letter, and phone call to envision my freedom. She used to
mm.
tell me,
Well,
see it, feel it, smell it, touch it, because it's yours. You're
well,
already free. And I used to lay in my bunk, Sam, and envision what my days out here were going to look like,
yeah.
at least once a day.
Yeah.
And I got to be honest, the life I'm living now is not too different than what I used to envision.
Wow.
And so I'm huge on manifesting your future. I give other people that advice now.
Hmm.
When they call me from prison and when they send me letters and I answer them, you know. So having that already in place,
Yeah.
seeing myself free before I even got out, and then having all the resources available to me once I came home
Yeah.
made all the difference. And
Which, just like you're
that
saying,
should be
that's
the case for everyone.
right. It should be. And you just had said it's so often not. Absolutely.
And I'll say this too. There was no reentry program
Yeah.
that I, was
Yeah.
able to enroll in or that was offered to me. And there's a lot of organizations out here who claim to do reentry work. It was a
Hmm.
big buzzword of a few years ago. Lots of organizations were getting a lot of money for
Yeah.
this. I don't know of any of them. My support came from the guys who came home before
Mm,
I did after
right.
doing decades.
Right.
We're in a unique situation here in Pennsylvania where because of a U.S. Supreme Court decision outlawing mandatory death by incarceration for children,
Mm,
and because of 50 or so people who were commuted by our last governor, there are hundreds of people out here right now
yeah.
who, as recent as a few years ago, were condemned to grow old and die in prison.
Mm,
And these were the guys who helped me get on my feet.
yeah.
They were the ones who were calling me, texting me, suggesting what bank to open an account in, what
Mm,
credit card to use, taking me on shopping sprees. And now I'm able to do that for
right.
guys who come home.
But it
Uh,
takes
I
community. It takes that
and
kind
and
of
that's what it
community.
was.
Wow.
Oh, it wasn't a program. It wasn't any
Yeah.
of these places who get all this federal, state, and local funding.
Yeah.
It was my guys.
Mm. I want to start to wrap up our time and point to a few things as we finish up. I saw in the chat, Dee Dee, you asked a question about, how do we interrupt some of these punishment-based ways of thinking and ways of living, even
Mm,
within a household or
mm.
within a family system? There's a lot of ways to answer that. One is this. I sent you a link that's a Google Doc because it's growing as we think about what does restorative parenting look like. But if maybe Felix and I, our next conversation needs to be how is being a parent wrecking, but also bring us to a place to desire and long for what does restoration even look like within my household? Um, being brought up in that way is really, really rare. And it's to do it, it's really hard. And it takes intentionality and the community. There's a few resources about that.
As Mariam Kaba says, the prisons and police are inside of us.
Right,
They're in our minds. They're in our bodies.
right,
We practice it in our homes, our schools,
right.
in every aspect of life.
Yeah. And it
And
takes a change, an
it's
intentional
going to
one
take
to
a
undo
whole
that.
upheaval
Yeah,
of mindset. We need a paradigm shift.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
we do that by doing the work and showing its results and little by little, bringing people into the circle.
We make the case. Yeah. Well, friends, a couple other things to point you to. One is, again, follow us on Facebook. You'll hear about conversations like these and lots of resources. I'll email this to you, but I also put in the chat Felix's link tree and a direct link to his book. Please make sure to check that out as well. And then the last thing that I'm going to point to is next month's In the Movement is focusing on a group called the One Race Movement that's looking at what does it look like to think about and move towards reconciliation as we especially think about the history of race and racism within this country. And that's going to be on March 4th. We're going to have a conversation of how can the church both acknowledge that reality and truth and the church's complicity in it and also work through that and towards unity and diversity. All of that relates to this because it requires a restorative approach. Felix, it's so great talking with
Mm.
you. It's always great to see you. It was fun running into you in real life.
Yes.
Uh, Thank you for sharing of your story and of yourself. And it's beautiful and encouraging and wrecking to hear all of this. But I'm thankful for the ways that God is working and for the way that you're responding to that and passing that work along to others. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. God bless you, Sam. God bless all of you viewers. And let's go forth and be peacemakers as we're called to do.
Yeah. Friends, thank you for joining us and blessings on your day. Bye bye.